Once upon a time, there lived a little old woman. She was very poor, and she lived in a small little cottage, and one day she was cleaning her house, and she pulled a dresser back away from the wall, and there in the corner she found a crooked little silver coin. Oh, she was very pleased to have found this, and she thought to herself what she would do with this money, and well, after giving it a lot of thought, the little old woman decided that she would go to market the next day and buy herself a pig. And that's exactly what the woman did. The next day she went to market, and she found a farmer who sold her a pig in exchange for her little silver coin, and the woman tied a little string around the pig's neck, and she started to lead the pig home. And when they were almost there, they came to a bridge, and the pig would not go over that bridge. Anything the woman tried, she pushed the pig. She pulled on the pig's rope. The pig would not cross the bridge. So the woman thought to herself, well, she was going to need some help. And so she went back down the road, back toward town, and she came to a dog. And she asked the dog, she said, "Dog, dog, bite my pig. Piggy will not cross the bridge, and I shall not get home tonight." But the dog wouldn't do it. And so the woman went down the road a little further until she found a stick. And she said, "Stick, stick, beat the dog. Dog will not bite the pig. Pig will not go over the bridge, and I shall not get home tonight." But the stick wouldn't do it. And so the old woman went down the road a little further until she came to a fire. And she said, "Fire, fire, burn the stick. Stick will not beat the dog. Dog will not bite the pig. Piggy will not go over the bridge, and I shall not get home tonight." But the fire wouldn't do it. And so the little old woman went down the road a little further until she came to some water. And she said, "Water, water, douse the fire. Fire will not burn the stick. Stick will not beat the dog. Dog will not bite the pig. Piggy will not go over the bridge, and I shall not get home tonight." But the water wouldn't do it. And so the little old woman went down the road a little further until she came to an ox. And she said, "Ox, ox, drink the water. Water will not douse the fire. Fire will not burn the stick. Stick will not beat the dog. Dog will not bite the pig. Piggy will not go over the bridge, and I shall not get home tonight." But the ox wouldn't do it. So the little old woman went down the road a little further until she came to a butcher. And she said, "Butcher, butcher, kill the ox. Ox will not drink the water. Water will not douse the fire. Fire will not burn the stick. Stick will not beat the dog. Dog will not bite the pig. Piggy will not go over the bridge, and I shall not get home tonight." But the butcher wouldn't do it. And so the little old woman went down the road a little further until she came to a rope. And she said, "Rope, rope, hang the butcher. Butcher will not kill the ox. Ox will not drink the water. Water will not quench the fire. Fire will not burn the stick. Stick will not beat the dog. Dog will not bite the pig. Piggy will not go over the bridge, and I shall not get home tonight." But the rope wouldn't do it. And so the little old woman went down the road a little further until she came to a rat. And she said, "Rat, rat, chew the rope. Rope will not hang the butcher. Butcher will not kill the ox. Ox will not drink the water. Water will not douse the fire. Fire will not burn the stick. Stick will not beat the dog. Dog will not bite the pig. Piggy will not go over the bridge, and I shall not get home tonight." But the rat wouldn't do it. And so the little old woman went down the road a little bit further until she found a cat. And the little old woman said to the cat, "Cat, cat, kill the rat. Rat will not chew the rope. Rope will not hang the butcher. Butcher will not kill the ox. Ox will not drink the water. Water will not douse the fire. Fire will not burn the stick. Stick will not beat the dog. Dog will not bite the pig. Piggy will not go over the bridge, and I shall not get home tonight." And the cat said to the little old woman, "If you will bring me some milk from yonder cow, I will kill the rat for you." And so the little old woman went over and she spoke to the cow. She said, "Cow, cow, may I have some milk?" And the cow said to the little old woman, "If you will bring me some hay from that haystack, I will give you some milk." And so the little old woman walked over to the haystack, and she brought back an armful of hay for the cow, and the cow gave her some milk, and the little old woman took the saucer of milk, and she fed it to the cat. And then the cat began to kill the rat began to chew the rope began to hang the butcher began to kill the ox began to drink the water began to douse the fire began to burn the stick began to beat the dog began to bite the pig was so afraid he ran across the bridge, and the little old woman finally got home that night. Once upon a time, there were two kings who were so jealous of each other that they finally ended by going to war. One king was a good king, and the other king was a bad king. And in between the two kingdoms there ran a great, deep, swift river. The only way to cross the river was by boat, because there was no bridge across the river, and the river was too wide and too swift to swim. Herein lies the problem with the war, you see, because the bad king had lots of boats. He had as many boats as he could possibly use, whereas the good king, on the other hand, had no boats whatsoever, not even a dinghy. So, you see, what was happening every day was that the bad king's army would all get into their boats, and they would come across the river, and they would attack the good king's army, and then they would get back into their boats, and they would go back across the river, and the good king's army could not launch any sort of a counterattack, because the good king's army could not cross the river. You see, the bad king could attack whenever he liked, and the good king could never attack. So it looked as if the bad king was going to win the war. Things were looking very bad for the good king. But the good king did have one small advantage. A captain in the good king's army was a very clever captain and a very hard-working captain. And one day this captain from the good king's army was out in the forest looking for enemy troops. He looked here, looked there, looked everywhere. Finally, he decided that if he were to climb up into the tallest tree in the forest, he would be able to see off to a greater distance, and in that manner he could see whether or not there were any enemy troops lurking in the distance. And so the captain rode his horse about until he found what appeared to him to be the tallest tree in the forest, and the captain got down off of the horse, and he climbed up into the tree. Well, he looked all around once he got up to the top, but he saw nothing, and so he turned to go back down the tree. But when he looked down, he saw that there at the base of the tree, where he had been standing not 5 minutes before, there was a large clearing, which he had certainly not seen from the ground. And in the middle of the clearing there was a big fire burning. The captain couldn't imagine how he might have missed that. And what was even funnier was that around the fire there were many, many children playing. And as the captain sat in the tree watching all the children playing around the fire, an old man walked out of the forest and into the clearing. And this old man was peculiar in that he had the biggest nose that the captain had ever seen. Now, I don't mean he just had a big nose. I mean he had a very big nose. His nose was so big that it was dragging along on the ground behind him back into the forest from whence he had come. Now, when the children saw this man with the big nose, they were all very excited, and they shouted out, "Look! It's Father Big Nose! Hello, Father Big Nose!" And the old man said, "Hello, my children." And the children shouted out, "What's new, Father Big Nose?" And the old man said, "Well, children, I do have some news for you, but you mustn't talk about it." There are two kings near here who are having a war, a good king and a bad king. But the bad king is going to win the war because there's a river that divides the two kingdoms, and the bad king has all the boats. The good king doesn't have any boats. The bad king can attack whenever he likes, and the good king can never attack. So, the bad king is going to win the war. But not far from here, there is a red tree. If one were to break a branch off of that red tree, one could lay that branch down upon the water, and wherever that branch was laid, a red bridge would be built across the river within a wink of an eye. And that red bridge would be so wide and so strong that an entire army could cross it all at once without any fear of its breaking. But that's a secret, and you mustn't talk about it. Crick, crack. He who lets this truth be known shall forthwith be turned to stone. And then the man with the big nose turned around and he walked back into the forest. Well, the captain didn't know what to make of all this. He sat up in his tree. He had heard everything that the man with the big nose had said. He didn't know whether or not to believe it. So he thought to himself that if he were to climb down the tree, he could talk to the children who were still there playing around the fire, and he could ask them if they could tell him something that he did not already know about this man with the big nose. And so the captain climbed down the tree, and he turned to where the clearing was, but there was no clearing there. There was no clearing. There was no fire. There were no children, and there was no man with a big nose. Well, the captain thought that he must have had his directions fouled up somehow, and so he walked all the way around the tree looking for the clearing. Well, he found no clearing, and so he made an ever-widening circle around the tree, looking for the clearing or the children or the fire. Well, he found none of these, but what he did eventually find was a red tree. It was the reddest tree that the captain had ever seen. He knew it must be the one that the old man had been talking about. The tree trunk was red, all the branches were red, all the leaves were bright, bright red. And so the captain thought it over for a few minutes, and then he reached up and he broke a branch off of the red tree, and then he went back to the castle to find the good king. And when the captain found the good king, the captain said to the king, "Your Majesty, put me in charge of all of the troops tomorrow, and I shall be responsible for winning an important victory." Well, now, the king didn't know what the captain was up to, but the king did know that this was a very clever captain, and moreover, the king knew that he himself had not been doing very well in leading his own troops into battle, and so the king said to the captain, "Very well. It shall all be done as you wish it. You shall be in charge of all of the troops tomorrow, and if you are successful in battle, you shall have a good reward." Well, the next day it happened once again as it had happened many times before. The bad king's army all got into their boats, and they started across the river to attack the good king's army. Now, the good king's army, on the other hand, and on the other side of the river, had taken up a very strong defensive position, and they were under strict orders from the captain that they were not to shoot any of their arrows, and they were not to throw any of their spears until they were given the orders to do so by the captain. Well, the bad king's army came across the river, and they all got out of their boats, and they ran inland, and they attacked the good king's army. They threw all of their spears, they shot all of their arrows, and then they all ran back to the river, and they all got back into their boats, and they started back across the river, laughing merrily as they went, because they knew they could not be followed. But the captain from the good king's army, with a red branch held high in the air, ran around a bend in the river, and he ordered his soldiers do likewise. So the entire good king's army ran around a bend in the river, out of sight of the bad king's army, and the good king's captain took the red branch, and he laid it down upon the water, and as soon as he did, blam! there was a red bridge built across the river, and the red bridge was so wide and so strong that the good king's entire army was able to run across it all at one time, and they got to the other side of the river before the bad king's army got there. They hid themselves in the woods, and when the bad king's army arrived on their side of the river, they got out of their boats, they started walking inland, and the good king's army attacked. Well, the good king's army had lots of arrows, they had lots of spears, and the bad king's army didn't have any arrows, they didn't have any spears, they'd left them all on the other side of the river. The bad king's army was devastated. They were obliterated. They were annihilated. The bad king had so few soldiers left that he was forced to sign a peace treaty. Not only had the captain won the battle, he had won the entire war. And all over the good king's kingdom there was feasting and merrymaking, and the good king called his captain to him, and he said, "Captain, I'd promised you a good reward if you were to be successful in battle. Well, not only did you win the battle, you won the entire war, and so the best reward that I can think to give you is my daughter's hand in marriage." Oh, and the good king's daughter was the most beautiful woman that anyone had ever seen. The captain had already been in love with her, and the wedding was set to take place 30 days from that date. And during those 30 days, the captain and the princess spent all their time together, enjoying the entertainments of the castle, and riding the king's horses through the forests, and walking through the castle gardens. It was not long before the princess was as in love with the captain as the captain was in love with the princess. And one day, the captain and the princess were sitting in the castle garden. By now, they were very much in love. And the princess said to the captain, "Oh, Captain, my dearest Captain, you are without a doubt the cleverest and bravest soldier in the entire world. But tell me, there's something I was wondering about. How were you able to build that red bridge across the river which won the war for us?" And the captain said to the princess, "Well, you won't believe this, but one day I was out in the forest looking for enemy troops, and I climbed up into the tallest tree in the forest, and when I got there, I looked down, and there was a clearing at the bottom of the tree, and in the middle of the clearing there was a big fire burning, and there were many, many children playing around the fire, and as I watched, an old man walked out of the forest and into the clearing, and he had the biggest nose I have ever seen, and..." Well, to make the long story a little bit shorter, the captain went on to tell the princess everything he had seen that day. He told her everything that the man with the big nose had said, and as soon as he had finished his story, blam! The captain was turned into stone. Well, the princess was horrified. She had always heard that a hard man was good to find, but this was ridiculous. She screamed out in terror. Everyone came running. Even the king came running. And when the king saw his captain standing there a statue, the king said, "What has happened to my captain?" And the princess told the king everything that the captain had said, and blam! The princess was turned into stone too. Well, the king gave orders that no one was to repeat anything that the princess had said. Then the king gave orders that both statues were to be taken to the chapel, and one was to be placed on either side of the altar, and then the king gave orders that the entire kingdom was to go into mourning. Everyone was required to be miserable from the time they woke up in the morning until the time they went to bed at night. Everyone was required to cry for at least a half an hour every day, and no one was allowed to laugh upon pain of losing his head. All over the kingdom, everyone was miserable. But there was no one who was any more miserable than the king himself. For not only had the king lost the best captain in his entire army, the king had also lost his only daughter, and he fretted over it and stewed over it and worried about it day after day. he could not help but think about that remarkable tale that his daughter had told before having been turned into stone, about the man with the big nose. And, well, the more the king thought about it, the more he remembered about it, until one day, as he was thinking about the man with the big nose, he happened to remember that his daughter had said something about the tallest tree in the forest. And the king thought to himself that this man with the big nose must somehow live near the tallest tree in the forest, and the king thought to himself that the tallest tree in the forest was certainly something that he himself could find. And so the king gave orders for his horse to be made ready, and the king got on his horse, and he rode out into the forest. Well, the king rode about looking for what seemed to be the tallest tree in the forest. Finally, he found a tree that appeared to him to be taller than most of the rest, but he remembered that his daughter had said something about there being a clearing at the bottom of the tallest tree in the forest. Well, there was no clearing at the bottom of this tree. But he thought to himself that if he were to climb up into the top of this tree, he would be able to see over the tops of most of the other trees, and in that manner he would be able to see where the tallest tree in the forest really was. And so the king got down off of his horse, and he climbed up into the top of the tall tree, and when he got up there, he looked all around, looking for a tree that was taller than the one that he was in, but he very quickly saw there was no tree any taller than the one that he was in. He was already in the tallest tree in the forest, and so the king thought that the whole thing must be some sort of a hoax, and so he turned to go back down the tree. But when he looked down, there at the base of the tree, where he had been standing not 5 minutes before, there was a big clearing. And in the middle of the clearing, there was a big fire burning, and around the fire there were many, many children playing. And within a minute, the king saw that his daughter had spoken nothing but truth. For out of the forest and into the clearing walked a man who had the biggest nose that the king had ever seen. His nose was so long that it was dragging along on the ground behind him back into the forest from whence he had come. And when the children who were playing around the fire saw this man with the big nose, they were all very excited. And they all shouted out, "Look! It's Father Big Nose! Hello, Father Big Nose!" And the old man said, "Hello, my children." And the children shouted out, "What's new, Father Big Nose?" And the old man said, "Well, children, I do have some news for you, but you mustn't talk about it. When I told you about how a red bridge could be built across a river, a captain from the good king's army was hiding in a tree near here, and he heard everything I told you, and he used my secret to build the red bridge and to defeat the bad king's army. But the captain could not keep my secret. He told his proposed new wife-to-be everything I told you, and of course as soon as he was turned into stone. Then the princess repeated everything that the captain had said, and she was turned into stone too. Now the entire kingdom is in mourning. Everyone is required to cry for a half an hour every day. But not far from here, there is a frozen spring. If one were to lift the ice up off the top of the frozen spring, one could fill a cup with water from the frozen spring, and then one could take that water back to the castle and pour half of the water over the captain's head and the other half of the water over the princess's head, and they would both be turned back into flesh and bone. But that's a secret, and you mustn't talk about it. Crick-crack! He who lets this truth be known shall forthwith be turned to stone. And then the man with the big nose turned around and he walked back into the forest. Well, the king didn't know what to make of all of this. And he, too, thought that he would climb down the tree and talk to the children who were playing around the fire, and so the king climbed down the tree and he turned toward the clearing, but there was no clearing there. There was no clearing, there was no fire, there were no children. And so the king went off in search of a frozen spring. He didn't really expect to find one. It was the middle of the summer. It was a very hot day. The king had not seen any ice since the February before, but much to his astonishment, within a half an hour, the king had found a frozen spring, and he was able to use a long stick to pry the ice up off the top of the frozen spring, and he took his golden goblet, and he filled his golden goblet with water from the frozen spring, and he took it very carefully back to the castle, and when he got there, he went straight away to the chapel, and he poured half of the water over the captain's head, and the other half of the water over the princess's head, and poof, they were both turned back into flesh and bone. Oh, the captain was very happy. The princess was even happier. She had been standing in a very uncomfortable position, and the king gave the order all over the kingdom. Everyone was to come out of mourning and to go back into celebration, because the princess and the captain were flesh and bone again, and moreover, their wedding was set to take place 1 week from that day. Everyone in the kingdom came out of mourning and went into celebration. All over the kingdom, everyone was happy. Everyone was happy except for the king. The king, you see, had a very curious wife. The king's wife was, of course, the queen, and the queen wanted to know how the king had changed the captain and the princess back into flesh and bone. Well, at first it was just a casual question. The queen said to the king, "Tell me, how were you able to change the princess and the captain back into flesh and bone? I'm so pleased they're ever so much nicer this way." But the king very wisely refused to divulge a secret that could have such dire consequences, and, of course, as soon as he did, the queen was livid. She was outraged. She shouted out, "What? You can't keep secrets from me. I won't stand for it. Now you tell me, right now, how did you do it? How did you change the captain and the princess back into flesh and bone? You tell me right now, or I'm going to make your life miserable." Well, the king wouldn't tell the queen the secret. And the queen did make the king's life miserable. She badgered him and pestered him and bothered him all the rest of that day until the king went to bed that night. And as soon as he woke up the next morning, she started in on him again. "How did you do it? How did you change the captain and the princess back into flesh and bone? You'd better tell me right now." And all through the second day, into the second night, until the king went to sleep that night. And during the night, the queen woke him up in the middle of the night, trying to catch him unaware. And she bothered him and pestered him on into the third day, all through the third day, into the fourth day. By the fourth day, the king was a little bit worried. By the fifth day, the king was very worried. And by the sixth day, the king decided that he was going to be changed into stone. Nothing could be any worse than what he was going through at the present time. And so the king decided that if he were going to be a statue for the next several hundred years, he should probably be a statue in a very prominent place. And so the king walked all around the castle looking for a good place for a statue to be, and finally he decided upon the central courtyard, and he stood in the middle of the central courtyard, and he tried several poses, thinking how he might look best as a statue, and then he went and changed his clothes, and he came back, and he tried standing a couple of different ways, and then he thought to himself, well, if he were going to be a statue for several hundred years, it would probably be best if he were sitting down. And at first he thought to have his throne brought round to the courtyard, when he thought to himself, no, he would appear to be a much more dashing statue if he were sitting on top of his horse. With his sword held high in the air. That way he would appear to be a much more military king, and his statue could commemorate his victory over the bad king. And so the king gave orders for his horse to be made ready, and within 5 minutes the king's horse was brought round to the central courtyard, and the king got on top of his horse, and he held his sword high in the air. He thought he looked very dashing, and he was all ready to give the order to have his wife brought round to the courtyard so that he could tell her the secret and thereby be turned into stone, when he thought to himself, "Oh dear, what if, when he was turned into stone, his horse was not turned into stone along with him?" Well, the horse would not be able to bear the weight of the statue. He would probably fall down almost immediately with a broken back. Within a couple of days, the horse would die. Within a week or two, the horse would begin to rot and stink. Well, the king thought he'd look a damned silly statue sitting there on a rotting horse, and so he rode the horse right out of the courtyard and back toward the forest. The king thought that if he could find the man with the big nose again, perhaps the man with the big nose could tell him how his horse could be turned into stone along with him. And so the king rode out into the forest, and he rode straight away to the tallest tree in the forest. He didn't bother looking for a clearing this time. He just got down off of his horse, and he climbed up into the tree, and when he got to the top of the tree, he looked down, and there was the clearing. In the middle of the clearing, there was the fire burning, and there were the children playing around the fire. And within a minute, the man with the big nose made his appearance, and the children were all very excited to see him, and they all shouted out, "Look! It's Father Big Nose! Hello, Father Big Nose!" And the old man said, "Hello, my children." And the children shouted out, "What's new, Father Big Nose?" The old man said, "Well, children, I do have some news for you, but you mustn't talk about it. When I told you about how the princess and the captain could be turned back into flesh and bone, the king was hiding in a tree near here. He heard everything I told you, and he used my secrets to find the frozen spring and to change the princess and the captain back into flesh and bone. But the king cannot keep my secret. He's going to tell the queen, and as soon as he does, he'll be turned into stone. But what the king does not know is that not far from here, next to the river, there is an orange tree. If one were to pick an orange off of that orange tree, one could eat that orange and then make a hole in the trunk of the orange tree. Then whoever had eaten the orange could whisper into the hole in the trunk of the tree every secret he had ever heard me speak. My secrets would travel down the trunk of the orange tree into the roots of the tree. They would go into the river, whereupon they would wash out into the ocean, where they would sink down into the bottom of the ocean. Then whoever had whispered my secrets into the trunk of the orange tree could repeat them as loudly as he liked, as many times as he wished, without any fear of being turned into stone. But that's a secret, and you mustn't talk about it. Crick, crack. He who lets this truth be known shall forthwith be turned to stone. And then the man with the big nose turned around, and he followed his nose back into the forest. Well, the king climbed down out of the tall tree. There was nothing more important to him than to find that orange tree, so he ran to the river, and he ran along that river until he found an orange tree. It was the only orange tree that the king had ever seen. He knew it must be the right one, and so he reached up and he picked an orange. He ate the orange. Peel and all, he didn't know how to eat oranges, and he took his knife, and he made a little hole in the trunk of the orange tree, and then very carefully he whispered into that hole everything he could remember, having heard the man with the big nose say, and then the king sat down and he thought and he thought. He tried to remember, was there anything else that the man with the big nose had said that he had forgotten to say into the orange tree, but at length the king could think of nothing else, and so the king went back and he got on his horse and he rode back to the castle. And when he got there, he rode straight into the courtyard, and he took out his sword, and he held it high in the air. You see, he still had that nagging feeling of doubt that he might not have remembered to say everything into the trunk of the orange tree. And then the king gave orders for the queen to be brought round to the courtyard. And when the queen came into the courtyard, she saw her husband sitting there on his horse with his sword held high in the air, and she shouted out, "Where have you been for the last 3 hours? Now, you'd better tell me right now, how did you do it? How did you change the captain and the princess back into flesh and bone? You'd better tell me right now, or I'm going to make you sorry for the rest of your life." And the king, very carefully, with his sword held high in the air, told the queen how he had used water from the frozen spring to change the captain and the princess back into flesh and bone. And the king was not turned into stone. The king had remembered to whisper everything into the orange tree, and the king was oh so happy, and the queen was very happy too, having finally found the secret of how the king had changed the princess and the captain back into flesh and bone, and the wedding between the captain and the princess was set to take place the very next day. Well, the wedding did take place the very next day, and if I had to tell you about all the feasting and all the merrymaking that went on at that occasion, it would take me until tomorrow. But suffice it to say that the captain and the princess were very happily married, and the king and the queen were very happy, and they ruled over that kingdom for many years to come. And so the king and the queen and the captain and the princess all lived happily ever after. A maiden from the Bosphorus, with eyes as bright as phosphorus, once wed the wealthy bailiff of the Caliph of Kelat. Though diligent and zealous, he became a slave to jealousy. Considering her beauty, 'twas his duty to be that. When business would necessitate a journey, he would hesitate, but fearing to disgust her, he would trust her with his keys, remarking to her prayerfully, "I beg you'll use them carefully. Don't look what I deposit in that closet, if you please." It might be mentioned casually that blue as lapis lazuli he dyed his hair, his lashes, his mustaches, and his beard, and just because he did it, he aroused his wife's timidity. Her terror she dissembled, but she trembled when he neared. This feeling insalubrious soon made her most lugubrious, and bitterly she missed her elder sister, Marie Anne. She asked if she might write her to come down and spend a night or two. Her husband answered rightly and politely, "Yes, you can." Bluebeard, the Monday following, his jealous feelings swallowing, packed all his things together in a leather-bound valise. Then, feigning reprehensibly, he started off, ostensibly by traveling, to learn a bit of Smyrna and of Greece. His wife made but a cursory inspection of the nursery. The kitchen and the airy little dairy were a bore, as well as big and scanty rooms, and billiard, bath, and ante-rooms, but not that interdicted and restricted little door. For all her curiosity awakened by the closet he so carefully had hidden and forbidden her to see, this damsel disobedient did something inexpedient, and in the keyhole tiny turned the shiny little key. Then started back impulsively and shrieked aloud convulsively. 6 heads of maids he'd wedded and beheaded met her eye. Then turning round much terrified, her darkest fears were verified, for Bluebeard stood behind her, come to find her on the sly. Perceiving she was fated to be soon decapitated too, she sent word to her brothers and some others what she feared, and Sister Anne looked out for them in readiness to shout for them whenever in the distance with assistance they appeared. But only from her battlement she saw some dust that cattle meant. The ordinary story isn't glory but a jest, but here's the truth unqualified, her husband wasn't mollified. Her head hangs in the bloody little study with the rest. The moral, wives we must allow, to whom their husbands will not bow, may find themselves at best berated, or heads from bodies separated. Once upon a time, there was a king who was such a mighty monarch that whenever he sneezed, every one in his entire kingdom had to say, "To your good health." Everyone said. Everyone in the entire kingdom. Any time the king sneezed, the king would tell the Lord Chamberlain, and the Lord Chamberlain would send out 500 messengers throughout the kingdom to tell everyone that the king had sneezed. And as soon as each person had heard that the king had sneezed, each person would turn toward the castle and shout out as loudly as he could, "To your good health!" Everyone said it. Everyone in the entire kingdom. Everyone that is, except for one single solitary shepherd. A shepherd very much like any other shepherd, except for the fact that this shepherd had the brightest blue, shining eyes that anyone had ever seen. And, of course, except for the fact that this shepherd would not say, "To your good health," whenever the king sneezed. Well, at length the king heard out about this, and the king was very angry. And the king sent 2 of his messengers to go and fetch the shepherd, to bring the shepherd to appear before the king. And so the next day the shepherd came, and he stood before the throne where the king sat, looking very grand and very powerful. But no matter how grand nor how powerful he might appear to be, the shepherd did not feel even a little bit afraid of him. And the king said to the shepherd, "Say to me, to my good health." The shepherd said, "To my good health." And the king said, "No, no, no. To my good health. To mine." And the shepherd said, "To my good health. To mine." And the king said, "No, you rogue, you varlet, you ne'er-do-well, to my good health, to my very own." And he beat his breast in a rage, and the shepherd said, "To my good health, to my very own." And he gently tapped his chest, and at that the king was so angry he did not know what to do. And so the Lord Chamberlain interrupted. The Lord Chamberlain ran up to the shepherd, and he whispered in the shepherd's ear, and he said, "Say at once, 'To your very good health,' for if you do not, you shall lose your life." And the shepherd said, "No, I will not say it until the princess is my wife." Now the princess was sitting there on a little throne next to the big throne of her father the king, and she looked just as sweet and just as pretty as a little golden dove, and upon hearing that which the shepherd had to say, she could not help but laugh. For there was no denying the fact that this shepherd with the bright blue shining eyes pleased her very much. In fact, he pleased her more than any king's son she had yet seen, and believe me, as of late she had been seeing a lot of king's sons. But the king was not nearly quite so pleasant as was his daughter, and so the king gave orders that the shepherd was to be thrown down into the pit with the wild bear. Well, the bear had not been fed for 4 days, and the bear was very hungry, and when the shepherd was thrown down into the pit with the bear moved toward the shepherd to tear him into pieces to make him into his supper. But the shepherd, you see, had been a shepherd ever since he had been a very small lad. Ever since he'd been very young, his job had been to protect his sheep from animals in the wild. Of course, he had had to protect his sheep from bears. He He had met with bears before, and he thought he knew how to deal with them. He stared at the bear as hard as he could with his bright blue shining eyes, and when the bear saw the shepherd's bright blue shining eyes, he was both terrified and mesmerized. Well, he stood there, stock still, for a few moments, and then he shrank shyly back into one corner, and he sat down, and he stared hungrily at the shepherd, and the shepherd sat down in the opposite corner, and he stared back at the bear. The shepherd knew that if he once took his eyes off of the bear, that the bear would tear him into pieces. So, in order to keep himself awake throughout the night, the shepherd made songs, and he sang them all night long. And the next morning, when the Lord Chamberlain came, expecting to find only the shepherd's bones, he was amazed to find the shepherd alive and well. And so the Lord Chamberlain took the shepherd to appear before the king again. Well, the king was somewhat surprised to see the shepherd, and the king said to the shepherd,
"Well, now that you have found what it is to be very near death, say to me, 'To my good health.'"
And the shepherd said, "No, I will not say it until the princess is my wife. I do not fear 10 deaths. And the king shouted out, "Very well, then, go to 10 deaths." And the king gave orders that the shepherd was to be thrown down into the pit with the wild wolves, of which, of course, there were 10. And so 2 guards laid hold of the shepherd, and they dragged the shepherd to the wolf pit. Now, the wolves had not been fed for a week. They were even hungrier than the bear had been, and when the shepherd was thrown down into the pit with wild wolves, they all rushed toward the shepherd to tear him into pieces, to make him into their supper. But, of course, the shepherd had been a shepherd ever since he had been a very small lad. Ever since he had been very young, his job had been to protect his sheep from animals in the wild. Of course he had to protect his sheep from wolves. Wolves are sheep's greatest enemies. He thought he knew how to deal with wolves, and what was more important, he thought he had the tool for the job. He took a little silver flute out of the sleeve of his jacket. Now, this silver flute had been handed down to him through many generations of shepherds. It was now his, and he began to play a merry tune, at which first the wolves stopped right where they were. The shepherd had expected this. He had seen it happen many times before out in the wild, but out in the fields, when the shepherd played the flute, the wolves would stop where they were, they would turn around, and they would run away. But here in the wolf pit, where they could not run away, they did something which the shepherd had not expected. The wolves stopped right where they were. They got up on their hind feet, and, well, you might not believe this, but then the wolves all began to dance. Well, they looked so silly, the shepherd would have given anything to have been able to laugh, but he knew that if he once stopped playing the flute, the wolves would tear him into pieces, and so he played on, slowly at first, as if in a minuet, and the wolves all danced slowly, and then by degrees he played faster and faster and faster and faster and faster, and the wolves all danced faster and faster and faster, until they could hardly twist and turn fast enough, and they all ended by falling all over each other on a heap on the ground, quite exhausted and out of breath. And at that, the shepherd did venture to laugh at last, and he laughed so hard and so long that when the Lord Chamberlain came the next morning, expecting to find only the shepherd's bones, he was amazed to find the shepherd alive and well. And so the Lord Chamberlain took the shepherd to appear before the king again. Well, the king was once again somewhat surprised to see the shepherd, and the king said to the shepherd,
"Well, now that you have found what it is to be very near 10 deaths, say to me, 'To my good health.'"
And the shepherd said, "No, I will not say it until the princess is my wife. I do not fear 100 deaths." Well, this gave the king a very good idea. And the king shouted out,
Well, then, go to 100 deaths. And the king gave orders that the shepherd was to be thrown down into the well of swords. And so 2 guards laid hold of the shepherd, and they dragged the shepherd down into the deep, dark dungeon. And there, in the middle of the deep, dark dungeon, there was a great, deep well. And if one were to look down into the well, one would see that there, embedded in the walls of the well, all the way from the top, all the way down to the bottom, there were 100 razor-sharp swords with their edges facing upward, so that if anything were thrown down into the well, it would be certain to be chopped to pieces by the time it reached the bottom. Well, now, after the shepherd had looked down into the well, he decided that he did not like it very well, and so he reached behind him into his knapsack, and he pulled out a bottle of whiskey, and he took off the top. He took a little drink of the whiskey, and then he passed the bottle over to the guards, and he asked the guards if the guards might not leave him alone for a few moments so that he might think this thing over. And, well, one never could tell. Perhaps he might, after all, decide to say, "To your good health," to the king. Well, the guards thought that this would be a very good thing indeed, and moreover, they were pleased to have the shepherd's bottle of whiskey, and so they took the bottle and they went and they sat down in one corner, and there they drank with great pleasure, and the shepherd sat down in the opposite corner, in the darkest corner of the dungeon. And then he took his shepherd's staff and he leaned it up against the wall. He stood up and he took his cap and he placed it on top of the staff. And then he took off his long cape and he wrapped the cape around the staff. And he took off his knapsack and he tied the knapsack to the staff inside the cape so that the cape might appear to have some body within. And then the shepherd sat down again, and he waited until the guards had finished with his bottle of whiskey, and then he called out to them. He said that he had given the matter due consideration, but that he could not, after all, decide to say that which the king wished. And so the guards stumbled over to where they'd heard the shepherd's voice, and they laid hold of the knapsack and the cape and the staff and the cap, and they dragged them all over to the well together, and they threw them all down the well together, and then they staggered back up the stairs, thinking to themselves, there, finally, was an end to that troublesome shepherd. But, of course, the shepherd was sitting in his dark corner, laughing all the time, and the next morning, when the Lord Chamberlain came, expecting to find pieces of shepherd pie at the bottom of the well, he was amazed to find the shepherd alive and well, sitting on the edge of the well. And so, as soon as the king was dressed, the Lord Chamberlain took the shepherd to appear before the king again. Well, the king was very surprised to see the shepherd, and the king said to the shepherd, "Well, now that you have found what it is to be very near 100 deaths, say to me, 'To my good health.'"
The shepherd said, "No, I will not say it until the princess is my wife." Well, the king was very angry, but the king was beginning to see that there was no easy way of doing away with this shepherd, and so he thought it over for a few minutes. And then the king gave orders for his golden coach to be made ready, and within 5 minutes the king's golden coach was brought round to the front door, and the king got in, and he bade the shepherd do likewise, whereupon the shepherd got into the coach, and he sat down right next to the king. And then the king gave orders for the driver to drive to the Silver Wood. When they'd arrived at the Silver Wood, the shepherd saw that here was a magnificent forest in which all the trees, both great and small, were made entirely of sterling silver. And the king said to the shepherd,
"Do you see the Silver Wood? Well, I'll give it to you. If you will but say to me that one simple thing, 'To my good health,' I will give you this Silver Wood."
The shepherd said, "No, I shall not say it until the princess is my wife." So the king was annoyed, and the king gave orders for the driver to drive on to the golden castle. And when they'd arrived at the golden castle, the shepherd saw that here was a huge, magnificent castle which was built entirely of solid gold. And the king said to the shepherd,
"Do you see my golden castle?
"Well,
I'll give it to you. If you will but say to me that one simple thing, to my good health, I will give you this golden castle and the silver wood."
The shepherd said, "No, I will not say it until the princess is my wife." So the king was vexed, and the king gave orders for the driver to drive on to the diamond pond. And when they'd arrived at the diamond pond, the shepherd saw that here was a large pond filled with crystal clear water, and its bottom was lined entirely with diamonds. And the king said to the shepherd,
"Do you see my diamond pond? It's the most valuable thing I own, but I'll give it to you if you will but say to me that one simple thing. To my good health, I will give you this diamond pond and the golden castle and the silver wood."
Well, the shepherd thought it over for a few moments, and then he said, "No, I will not say it until the princess is my wife." And at that, the king was more angry than anyone had seen him in years, and he shouted out,
"All right! You may have my daughter to wife. It makes no difference to me, but then you really and truly must say to me, 'To my good health.'"
The shepherd said, "Well, of course I'll say it. It makes sense that I'd say it then. Why should I not say it?" And at that, the king was delighted. They all got back into the coach, and they rode back to the castle. And when they got there, the king told the Lord Chamberlain to send all the messengers out throughout the kingdom, not to tell everyone that the king had sneezed, but instead to tell everyone that the princess was going to be married. And all over the kingdom, everyone rejoiced to think that the princess, who had refused so many royal suitors, would have ended by falling in love and marrying a bright-eyed shepherd. And all over the kingdom there was feasting and merrymaking, but on the day of the wedding, the greatest feasting and the greatest merrymaking of all was there in the castle of the king, for there the best bands played, and the best foods were cooked, and a great huge multitude of people sat down to table. And when, according to custom, the bridegroom bought the great roast pig with the apple in its mouth so that he could cut it up and give everyone a share, he set it down before the king. But the savory, peppery smell from the roast pork was so strong that the king began to sneeze with all of his might, whereupon the shepherd shouted out, "To your very good health, your majesty," before anyone else could say anything. And the king was so surprised and so shocked that he had a heart attack and died on the spot. Well, the shepherd had just married the king's daughter, and so everyone agreed that the shepherd should be the new king. Well, the shepherd made a very good king, and he never expected anyone to wish him well against his will. But since he was such a good and kind and benevolent king, everyone did wish him well at every possible opportunity. And so the shepherd, who was now the king, and the princess, who was now his queen, both lived happily ever after. A strange and unusual history concerning a visit to the home of Sir Gammer Vans. Late last Saturday night, early in the morning, as I was sailing over the tops of the mountains in my little rowboat, I happened upon two men on horseback riding a cow. And I asked them if they could tell me whether or not the old woman had died yet who had been hung the Thursday evening before for having drowned herself in a shower of feathers. They said that they could not positively inform me, but that if I were to go and seek out Sir Gammer Vans, he could give me true intelligence. How shall I know his house, said I. Oh, 'tis simple enough, said they, for 'tis a brick house built entirely of wood, standing alone by itself in the midst of 60 or 70 others just like it. Oh, nothing could be easier, said I. Oh, nothing is easier, said they. Now, as it turned out, this Sir Gammer Vans was a giant and a bottle maker. And as all giants who are bottle makers usually pop out of little medicine bottles from behind the front door, so did Sir Gammer Vans. How do you do, said he. Very well, thank you, said I. Would you care to have some breakfast with me, said he. With all my heart, said I, and so he gave me a mug of beef and a slice of beer, and there was a little dog under the table who lapped up all the crumbs. Hang him, said I. No, don't hang him, said he, for he is a good dog. He killed a rabbit yesterday, and if you don't believe me, I'll show you the rabbit alive in a basket. And so we went out into the garden to view the curiosities. In one corner there was a fox hatching eagle's eggs. In the second corner there was a gorilla reading Shakespeare, and in the third corner there was the rabbit which the dog had killed the day before, alive in the basket, and in the fourth corner there were 24 hipper switches threshing tobacco, and at the sight of me they threshed so hard that they drove the plug through the wall and through the little dog who was passing by on the other side. I, hearing the dog howl, leapt over the wall and turned the dog as neatly inside out as was possible at the time, whereupon it ran away as if it had not an hour to live. Then Sir Gammer Vans suggested that we go into the park to see the deer, and I remembered that I had a warrant in my pocket to shoot venison for His Majesty's table, and so I poised my arrow, I set fire to my bow, and I shot amongst them. Well, I broke 11 ribs on one side and 17.5 ribs on the other side, but the arrow passed clean through without ever having touched it, and the worst of it was I lost my arrow. However, I found it again inside of a hollow tree. I felt it. It felt sticky. I smelt it. It smelt honey. Ho, ho, said I, 'tis a bee's nest, when out sprang a covey of partridges. I shot amongst them. Some say I killed 18, but I'm sure that I killed 36, along with a dead salmon, which was flying over the bridge at the time, of which I made the best apple pie I have ever tasted. Awake, arise, tear out your eyes, and see the time of day, and when you have done, cut out your tongue, and see what you can say. Once upon a time, there lived a lad whose name was Jack. Now, Jack lived in a small house out in the forest along with his father, and it so happened that Jack's father was a very, very mean man. Jack's father used to hit Jack any time Jack did the tiniest little thing wrong, and on days when Jack didn't do anything wrong, well, Jack's father would hit him anyway just to keep in good practice, until finally one day Jack thought to himself that he could do quite well without this sort of treatment, and so Jack decided to run away from home. And that's exactly what Jack did do. He ran away from home, and I promise you, he ran. He ran and 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 he ran until he could run no further, when he ran right into a little old woman who was picking up sticks alongside the road. Now, Jack was much too much out of breath to beg the old woman's pardon, and so, fortunately, the old woman, being a good-natured sort, said that Jack appeared to be a likely sort of a lad, and she said that if Jack would agree to be her servant for 12 months and a day, that she would pay Jack very well for his help at the end of that year. Well, now Jack had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do, And so Jack decided that he would be the old woman's servant for a year and a day. Well, the months went by. Finally, the year was over, and the old woman called Jack into her barn, and she said, "Jack, you've done a wonderful job. You've worked hard, and you've worked well, and I should now like to pay you for all of the help that you have given me." And so saying, the old woman gave Jack a donkey. Oh, but this was no ordinary donkey, you see, for all one had to do was to pull this donkey's ear, and the donkey would say, "Hee-haw!" And out of the donkey's mouth would fall copper and silver and golden coins. Well, Jack thought that he'd been paid very well for his year of work, and so Jack got on top of his donkey and he rode off in the direction of his father's house, but it was very nearly dark, and Jack didn't want to travel through the forest alone by night, and so Jack decided that he would spend that night in an inn. You see, up until that time, Jack had never had enough money to spend a night in an inn, and he thought that it might be a jolly thing to try, and so Jack put his donkey into the barn, and he went into the inn, and he called to the innkeeper, saying, "Innkeeper, bring me the best food in the house, and a bottle of your finest wine." And the innkeeper looked at Jack, and he said, "No, sir, I will bring you nothing. Not unless you pay me for it first." And so Jack went out into the barn. You see, the innkeeper thought that Jack had no money. He still appeared to be a very poor man, so Jack went out into the barn, and he pulled his donkey's ear, and his donkey said, "Hee-haw!" And out of the donkey's mouth fell copper and silver and golden coins. Well, Jack pulled his donkey's ear a few more times until he had its pockets full of money, and then he went back into the inn. But unbeknownst to Jack, that innkeeper had been watching Jack through a crack in the barn wall. And he had seen where Jack had gotten his money, and he had seen how that donkey had worked, and that innkeeper decided that he wanted that donkey for his very own. And so he waited until Jack had gone to sleep. And then the innkeeper snuck out into his barn, and he stole Jack's donkey. But he replaced it with another donkey that looked very much like Jack's donkey. So Jack woke up the next morning, none the wiser, not knowing any switch had been made. Jack got on top of that worthless donkey, and he rode off in the direction of his father's house. Now, I should tell you, near Jack's father's house there lived a widow woman who had an only daughter. Now, the only daughter of the widow woman had been Jack's very best friend ever since they'd been very small children, and now that they were very nearly grown up, well, they were very much in love, and they wanted to be married. So when Jack arrived at his father's house, Jack asked his father's permission to marry the daughter of the widow woman who lived down the road. And Jack's father said, "No, Jack, you may not marry that girl. You could not possibly afford to keep her." But Jack said, "Oh, Father, I can easily afford to keep the girl. I have a magical donkey. You won't believe this. Now come out into the barn and look at this." And so Jack's father followed Jack out into the barn, and Jack pulled the donkey's ear, and the donkey did indeed say, "Hee-haw!" But, of course, nothing came out of the donkey's mouth. For as we well know, Jack had the wrong donkey, but Jack didn't know. And so he pulled the donkey's ear again, and once again the donkey said, "Hee-haw!" But still nothing came out of the donkey's mouth. No gold, no silver, not even a copper penny. And so Jack pulled, and he pulled, and he pulled, until the donkey's ear came off in his hand. But still nothing came out of the donkey's mouth, and Jack's father thought that Jack was trying to make a fool of him. And so Jack's father took a hay fork down from the wall, and he used it to hit Jack. Well, he hit Jack again and again and again and again, and Jack ran out of the barn, and he ran away from home for the second time. And this time he ran and 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 he ran until he could run no further, when he ran right into a large wooden door. And upon opening the door, Jack found himself in a carpenter's shop. Well, the carpenter was rather surprised to see Jack so far out into the forest, but he said that Jack appeared to be a likely sort of a lad. And he told Jack that if Jack would agree to be his servant for 12 months and a day, that he would pay Jack very well for his help at the end of that year. Well, once again, Jack had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do. And so Jack agreed to be the carpenter's servant for a year and a day. Well, the months went by. Finally, the year was over, and the carpenter called Jack to him, and he said, "Jack, you've done a wonderful job. You've worked hard, you've worked well, and I should now like to pay you for all the help that you have given me." And so saying, the carpenter gave Jack a table. Oh, but this was no ordinary table, you see, for all one had to do was to say, "Come, my table, be spread," and immediately the table would cover itself with all sorts of good things to eat and fine things to drink. Well, once again, Jack thought that he'd been paid very well for his year of work, and so Jack hitched his table upon his back, and he headed off once again in the direction of his father's house. Well, Jack finally, on his way to his father's house, stopped at that same inn. You see, it was nearly dark again. Jack didn't want to travel through the forest alone by night. And so Jack decided that he would spend that night in that very same inn. And so he went into the inn and he called to the innkeeper, saying, "Innkeeper, bring me the best food in the house and a pitcher of your finest ale." The innkeeper said, I'm sorry, sir. We've just run out of ale, and, well, the only food we have in the house is asparagus and liver." And Jack said, "Asparagus and liver? For me? Blech! I can do better than that." And so saying, Jack brought his table into the room. He set it in the middle of the room, and he said, "Come, my table, be spread." And immediately the table covered itself with all sorts of good things to eat. There was a roast beef, there was a turkey, there was a leg of lamb, there was a pot of potatoes, several kinds of vegetables, some bread, some cheese, a bowl of ice cream, a bottle of wine, a pitcher of ale, 2 cupcakes, all the things that Jack liked best. But that innkeeper had seen how Jack's table had worked, and he thought to himself that he could save himself a great deal of work in the kitchen if he were to have a table such as that. But he said nothing, no, not he. He waited until Jack had gone to sleep, and then the innkeeper snuck up into his attic, and he brought down an old table that looked very much like Jack's table, and he switched the 2 tables around. And so Jack woke up the next morning, none the wiser, not knowing any switch had been made. Jack hitched that worthless table upon his back, and he headed off once again in the direction of his father's house. And when Jack arrived at his father's house, Jack once again asked his father's permission to marry the daughter of the widow woman who lived down the road. And once again Jack's father said, "No, Jack, you may not marry that girl. You could not possibly afford to feed her." But Jack said, "Oh, Father, I can easily feed the girl. I have a magical table. Now watch this." And so saying, Jack brought the table into the middle of the room. He set it down in the middle of the room, and he said, "Come, my table, be spread." Come, my table, be spread. But, of course, nothing appeared on the table, for as we well know, Jack had the wrong table, and Jack's father thought that Jack was trying to make a fool of him again. And so Jack's father took a warming pan down from the wall, and he used it to warm Jack's bottom. And he hit Jack again and again and again and again, until Jack finally remembered why he had run away from home the first 2 times, and he ran away from home again. And this time he ran until he could run no further, when he ran right into a deep, swift river. Well, now Jack couldn't swim. He cried out, "Help! I can't swim! I can't swim!" There was a man standing on the bank of the river. He shouted back, "I can't swim either, but I'm not bragging about it." But finally, Jack was able to communicate to the man that he was in dire distress. He needed some sort of assistance. Fortunately, the man was carrying a long walking stick. He was able to reach the stick out to Jack, and Jack laid hold of the stick. The man pulled Jack up onto the shore to safety, and after Jack had caught his breath, he introduced himself to the man, and the man said to Jack, "Jack, I myself am trying to get to the other side of this river, but I can swim no better than you. So I have determined that the best way for us to cross the river is for me to chop down this tall tree and to let the tree fall across the river, and then we can use the tree as a bridge. But Jack, I'm worried that when I chop the tree down, the tree may very well fall the wrong way, and then all of my labor would be for naught. So, Jack, what I was thinking you might do is, I was thinking you might climb up into the top of the tree and lean your weight against the tree, so that when I chop through the bottom of the tree will be certain to fall the right way." Well, now Jack was none too bright, and so Jack did exactly as the man had suggested. He climbed up into the top of the tree. He leaned his weight against the tree while the man chopped through the bottom of the tree, and finally the tree fell across the river, depositing Jack upon the opposite shore and making a perfectly delightful bridge. And the man came across his new bridge to where Jack was lying upon the ground, and he said, "Jack, you've done one heck of a job, and I'd like to pay you for your help." And so saying, the man tore a limb off of that tree, and he used his knife to carve it into a sort of a walking stick or a staff, much like the one he himself was carrying. And he handed the stick to Jack, and he said, "Here, Jack, take this stick. And from this day forth, if any man should ever happen to anger you, you have but to say, 'Up, stick,' and bang him. And your stick will fly from your hand and attack your enemy and beat him into submission." Well, now, Jack was rather glad to have this stick, for by now, you see, he was growing the tiniest bit suspicious of that innkeeper. And so Jack went back to that inn, and when the innkeeper appeared, Jack shouted out, "Up, stick!" and bang him, and his stick flew from his hand, began to beat the innkeeper on the head and bruise his ribs and batter his legs. Finally, the innkeeper fell down upon the ground, and still the stick beleaguered the prostrate man, until Jack said, "I shall not tell that stick to stop hitting you until you return the donkey and the table that you've stolen from me." Well, the innkeeper made no bones about it. He returned Jack's donkey, and he returned Jack's table, and Jack told his stick to stop hitting the man. He got on top of his donkey, he hitched his table to his back, and with his stick in his hand, Jack headed off once again in the direction of his father's house. Well, when Jack arrived at his father's house, Jack found that his father had died while he'd been gone. Well, Jack was not too upset about that. As a matter of fact, Jack was rather glad. Jack took his donkey into what was now his barn, and he pulled his donkey's ear, and once again his donkey said, "Hee-haw!" And out of the donkey's mouth fell copper and silver and golden coins. Well, Jack pulled his donkey's ear for about an hour and a half, until he had a large manger full of money. Well, it was not long before all the people who lived in the town near where Jack lived found out that Jack had returned home rolling in wealth, and that Jack was now a very rich man. And suddenly, all of the women who lived in that town all decided that they all wanted to marry Jack. This rather annoyed Jack, you see, for up until that time, none of those women had even wanted to talk to Jack, let alone marry him. Well, that is, of course, except for Jack's own true love, the daughter of the widow woman who lived down the road. Why, she had always loved Jack, and she had always wanted to marry Jack, so she was upset when Jack went into the town one night and made an announcement. Jack went into the town, he stood in the middle of the town square, and he shouted out as loudly as he could, "All of the women in this town who wish to marry me, come to my house tomorrow morning, and bring with you all of your gold and all of your silver coins held in your aprons. And the one of you who has the most money is the one who I shall marry." Accordingly, the next morning there was a great long line of women in front of Jack's house, and all of them had their aprons held out, and all of them had gold and silver coins in their aprons. All of them, that is, except for Jack's own true love. Well, she was there, and she had her apron held out, but she had no gold, and she had no silver. She had naught but 2 copper pennies, and that was all. And Jack spoke harshly to her. He said, You have no gold, you have no silver. Get out of the line. Go over there and sit down next to my house." Well, the poor girl was heartbroken, and she cried a little bit, but she did as she was told. She got out of the line, and she walked over, and she sat down next to Jack's house, whereupon Jack shouted out, "Up, stick!" and bang them, and his stick flew from his hand, went down the line of women, hit them all on top of their heads, knocked them all senseless down to the ground. Then Jack went along the line, and he picked up all the gold and all the silver coins. He took them all, and he put them all in the lap of his own true love, and he said, "There, you are now the richest. It is you who I shall marry." That's exactly what Jack did do. And along with the help of his donkey, his table, and his stick, they all lived happily ever after. Long ago, the Lincolnshire swamps were full of bogs, and it was death to walk through them at night, especially on nights when the moon did not shine. For harm and mischance and mischief and bogles and dead things and crawling horrors came out on nights when the moon did not shine. Well, at length the moon heard out about this, and she decided to go down into the boglands to see for herself and find out what she could do to help. And so at month's end she wrapped a black cloak around her, and she pulled a black hood over her shining golden hair, and she stepped down into the boglands. It was all dark and watery, with quaking mud and waving tussocks of grass, and no light except what came from her own white shining feet. But on she went into the midst of the bogland, and now the witches rode about her on their great black cats, and the will-o'-the-wykes danced with the lanterns swinging on their backs, and the dead folk rose up out of the water and stared at her with fiery eyes, and the slimy dead hands beckoned and clutched. But on she went, stepping from tuft a tuft as light as the wind in the summer, until at length a stone turned under her foot, and she grabbed with both hands at a snag nearby to steady herself, but as soon as she touched it, it twisted round her wrists like a pair of handcuffs and held her fast. She struggled and fought against it, but nothing would free her, and then as she stood trembling, she heard a piteous crying, and she knew that a man was lost in the darkness, and soon she saw him splashing after the Will-o'-the-Wykes, crying out on them to wait for him, while the dead hands plucked at his coat, and the creeping horrors crowded round him, and he went further and further from the path. Well, the moon was so sorry and so angry that she made a great struggle to free her hands, and though she could not loose her hands, her hood slipped back, and the light streamed out from her beautiful golden hair, so that the man saw the bog holes near him and the safe path in the distance nearly as clear as by day. He cried out for joy and floundered across, out of the deadly bog and back to safety, and all the bogles and evil things fled away from the moonlight and hid themselves. But the moon struggled in vain to free herself, and at length she fell forward, spent with the struggle, and the black hood fell back over her hair, and she had not the strength to push it off. Then all the evil things came creeping back again, and they laughed to think that they had their enemy and the moon in their power at last, and all night long they fought and squabbled over how best they should kill her. But when the first gray light before dawn appeared, they grew afraid, and they pushed her down under the water, and the dead folk held her there, and the bogles found a great long stone to put over her, and they chose 2 Will-o'-the-Wykes to guard her by turns, and when morning came, the moon was buried deep until someone should find her, but who knew where to look? Well, the days passed, and folk put straw in their caps and money in their pockets against the coming of the new moon, but the new moon never came. And as dark night after dark night passed, the evil things from the boglands grew braver and bolder, and they came howling and screeching up to men's very doors, so that no one could go a step from the house at night. And in the end, folks sat up all night shivering by their fires, for they feared that if the lights went out, the things would come over the thresholds. Well, at last they went to the wise woman who lived in the old mill to ask her what had become of their moon. Well, she looked in the book, and in the mirror, and in the brew pot, but it was all dark. So she told them to set straw and salt and a button on their door-sills at night to keep them safe from the horrors, and to come back with any news they could give her. Well, you can be sure they talked at their firesides and in the tavern and in the town, until one day, as they were sitting on the settle at the inn, a man from the far side of the bogland cried out on a sudden, "I think I might know where the moon is. Only I was so mazed on it at the time, I never thought about it." And he went on to tell them how he had been all lost and astray one night in the bogland, and like to lose his life in the bog holes, when on a sudden a clear, white, bright light had shone out and showed him the bog holes in front of him and the safe path in the distance nearly as clear as by day. And so off they all went to the wise woman, and they told her what the man had said. Well, she looked in the mirror, and she looked in the brew pot, and at length she saw a hazy, foggy picture of the place where she thought the moon was, and she told them what they must do. They were to set out all together in the middle of the night with a pebble in their mouths, and with a hazel twig in their hands, and not a word must they speak until they got home again. And they were to travel into the midst of the bog until they found a place where there was a coffin, and a cross, and a candle, and that was where the moon would be. Well, they were main feared, but the next night they set out, and they went on and on into the midst of the bog. Well, they saw nothing, but all around them they heard a sighing and whispering, and they felt the slimy dead hands touching them, but on they went, shaking and scared, until suddenly they stopped, for there, half in and half out of the water, there was a great long stone which looked for all the world like a coffin. And near its head a snag stretched out 2 branches that looked like a gruesome cross, and a third branch, a much smaller one, had 2 fireflies sitting on its tip, so that looked for all the world like a candle. And so they all knelt down round the stone, and they said the Lord's Prayer, forward for the sake of the cross, and backwards against the bogles, but all silently, for they knew they must not speak. And then all together they heaved up the stone, and for one brief moment they saw a beautiful, shining face looking up at them, and then, with a great shrieking wail from all the horrors and the crawling evil things as they fled away from the moonlight, the next minute the moon was shining down on them from the heavens, so that they could see their path home, near as clear as by day. And ever since then, the moon has shown her best over the boglands, for she knows the evil things that are hiding there, and she remembers how the people of Lincolnshire came out to look for her, and she was dead and buried. The story of the Well of the World's End is an interesting story, but it's a story that gets me into trouble from time to time, you see, because it's a story about a wicked stepmother. All of the children in the audience who have stepmothers will think that all of their stepmothers are all evil and wicked and rotten and all out to get them, and those children could very well be psychologically damaged for life. You see, I mostly get this complaint from wicked stepmothers, so I always like to say, before I ever start this story, most stepmothers are very nice ladies. It just so happens that the one in this story was one of the wicked variety. So bearing this in mind, once upon a time, there lived a girl whose mother had died and her father had married again, so you see the girl got herself a new mother. That is to say, she got herself a stepmother. But oh, the girl's stepmother hated the girl, for you see, the girl was a beautiful, fair young maiden, and her stepmother was an ugly, old hag, and she was very jealous of her daughter. Well, now, oddly enough, as it happened, about a week after the girl's father had married this stepmother, why, the girl's father died of some sort of mysterious food poisoning, and the girl's stepmother inherited all of his money and the house and the girl as well, and from that day forth the girl had to do all of the servants' work. She had to scrub the floors and wash the dishes and clean out the pigs' pens. Well, she never had any peace whatsoever until finally one day the girl's stepmother was feeling so very jealous that she thought to be rid of her daughter altogether, and so she handed her daughter a sieve. And she said, "Here, take this sieve, and take it to the Well of the World's End, and bring it home to me full of water from the Well of the World's End, or woe betide you." For you see, the girl's stepmother thought that the girl would never be able to find the Well of the World's End, and Well, even if she could find the Well of the World's End, how could the girl bring home a sieve full of water, since, as we well know, a sieve has so many holes in the bottom of it that it will not hold water? But the girl took the sieve nonetheless, and she went off along her way, and she asked every one she met where the Well of the World's End was. "Where is the Well of the World's End? Have you seen the Well of the World's End? Do you know where the Well of the World's End is?" But no one knew where the Well of the World's End was. Well, the girl asked every one she met for 3 days where the Well of the World's End was. No one seemed to know, until finally, at the end of that third day, it was growing dark, it was getting cold, the girl was tired, she was ready to give up altogether, when she met a little old woman by the side of the road, all queer and bent over double, and the girl asked the little old woman where the Well of the World's End was. And the little old woman knew. And the little old woman told the girl where the Well of the World's End was and what she would have to do in order to get there. Oh, the girl was very happy, and she went off along her way, and she followed her instructions very carefully, and after she had walked for 3 more days, she arrived finally at the Well of the World's End. And the girl took her sieve, and she dipped it into the cold, cold water, but, of course, as soon as she lifted her sieve up out of the water, well, all the water fell out through the holes in the bottom, and the sieve was empty again. And so she tried it again. She dipped her sieve into the water, and once again all the water ran out through the holes in the bottom. Well, she tried it again and again and again, but each time it was the same. The sieve would be emptied nearly as quickly as it had been filled, until finally the girl just didn't know what to do. And so she sat down on the edge of the Well of the World's End, and she cried, and she cried, and she cried, when suddenly she heard a deep, rumbly voice from very close by, and she looked next to her, and there, sitting beside her on the edge of the Well of the World's End, there was a big, green frog with big Google eyes. And the frog said to the girl, "What's the matter, dearie?" And the girl said, "Oh, me? Oh, my wicked stepmother has sent me all this long way to fill my sieve with water from the Well of the World's End, and I can't seem to fill it no matter how hard I try. All the water keeps running out through the holes in the bottom. It just leaks like a sieve, and I just don't know what to do." And the frog said to the girl, "If you will agree to do everything I tell you for a whole night long, I will tell you how to fill your sieve with water from the Well of the World's End." Well, the girl didn't know what else to do. She needed some help from someone, and she certainly wasn't likely to run into anyone else there at the Well of the World's End, and so she said to the frog, "All right, I'll agree. I will do everything you tell me to do for a whole night long. Now, will you please tell me what it is that I have to do in order to fill my sieve with water from the Well of the World's End?" And the frog said to the girl, "Line it with moss, then daub it with clay, and then it will carry the water away." And so the girl took her sieve, and she walked a short distance away from the Well of the World's End until she came upon a large rock which was covered with moss, and she very carefully peeled some of the moss off of the rock, and she lined the bottom of her sieve with moss, and, well, not far from there, the girl found some clay, and so she took clay and she smeared clay all over the top of the moss until all the holes in the bottom of the sieve were filled in. And then the girl took her sieve back to the Well of the World's End, and she dipped it into the cold, cold water, and this time all the water stayed inside the sieve. None of it ran out through the holes in the bottom. Oh, the girl was just as happy as she could be, and she turned to leave when the frog said to her, "Don't forget your promise." And the girl said, Yes, I know. I've promised to do everything you tell me to do for a whole night long, and I will gladly do so the next time I see you." For you see, the girl thought that she would never see the frog again. She lived so far away, the frog would never be able to find her, and, well, even if the frog did find her, well, what possible harm could a frog do? And so the girl went off along her way, and the frog went plop, splash, right into the Well of the World's End. Well, the girl walked for 3 more days, and she arrived finally at her home, and since she'd been very careful along her way, she still had her sieve full of water from the Well of the World's End, and so the girl found her stepmother, and she handed her stepmother the sieve, but, oh, the girl's stepmother was not at all pleased as the girl had expected. No, she was just as angry could be, but, well, there was nothing the stepmother could say, for after all, the girl had only done what her stepmother had told her to do. But later on that evening, those two were sitting near the fire, the girl and her stepmother, and they heard a little tap, tap, tapping at the door. And a deep, rumbly voice way low down said, "Open the door, my honey, my sweetheart. Open the door, my sweet darling. Remember the words that you and I spoke down by the Well of the World's End." And the girl's stepmother turned to her daughter, and she said, "What was that?" And the girl had to tell her stepmother that when she had gone to the Well of the World's End, that she had met a frog there, and that it had been the frog who had told her how to fill her sieve with water from the Well of the World's End, and she also told her stepmother that she had promised to do everything the frog told her to do for a whole night long in exchange for the frog's good advice. Well, now, the girl's stepmother thought that it was funny that her daughter would have to take orders from a frog for a whole night long, and so she said to her daughter, "Now, you made that frog a promise, and girls must keep their promises. Now, you promised to do everything that frog said for a whole night long, so he just said, 'Open the door.' So you go and open the door." And so the girl walked over, and she opened up the door, and the frog hopped in, and they all sat down near the fire, and after a little while the frog said to the girl, "Pick me up on your knee, my honey, my sweetheart. Pick me up on your knee, my sweet darling. Remember the words that you and I spoke down by the Well of the World's End. Oh, but the girl didn't want to pick up the frog and put him on her knee. The frog was all green and slimy and cold and clammy and wet and icky. Oh, the girl didn't even want to touch the frog, and so she said to the frog, "Oh, Mr. Frog, I'd really rather not have you sitting on my knee right now, if you really don't mind." But the girl's stepmother... Well, the girl's stepmother thought that it was funny that her daughter would have to have a slimy frog sitting on her knee, and so she said to her daughter, "Now you made that frog a promise, and girls must keep their promises. Now you promised to do everything that frog said for a whole night long, so you pick up that frog and you put him on your knee right now." And so the girl had to do it. Oh, she didn't like the idea, not even a little bit, but she reached down and she picked up the frog, and he was all green and slimy and cold and clammy, but the girl picked the frog up anyway, and she set him on her knee, and there they sat for quite some time before the frog said to the girl, "Feed me some supper, my honey, my sweetheart. Feed me some supper, my sweet darling. Remember the words that you and I spoke down by the well of the world's end." Well, the girl didn't mind doing that so much. In fact, she was glad to have the frog off of her knee, and so she picked the frog up and she put him on the kitchen table, and she brought him some bread and some cheese and a bowl of dead flies with mustard on the side, and she fed him quite well, for a frog. But after the frog had finished eating, and after the girl had taken away his dishes, the frog spoke to the girl again. And this time he said to the girl, "Take me with you to bed, my honey, my sweetheart. Take me with you to bed, my sweet darling. Remember the words that you and I spoke down by the well of the world's end." Oh, but the girl didn't want to take the frog to bed with her. She hadn't even liked touching the frog, or picking him up, or putting him on her knee. She certainly didn't want to take the frog to bed with her and sleep with him all night long, and so she said to the frog, "Oh, Mr. Frog, I really think you'd be much more comfortable sleeping here by the fire, now don't you?" But the girl's stepmother... Well, the girl's stepmother thought that this was the funniest thing that she had ever seen, that her daughter would have to sleep all night long with a green, slimy frog, and so she said to her daughter, "Now you made that frog a promise, and girls must keep their promises. Now you promised to do everything that frog said for a whole night long, so you pick up that frog, you take him with you to bed, or out you go, you and your froggy both." And so the girl had to do it. Oh, she didn't like the idea, not even a little bit, but she picked the frog up off of the kitchen table, and oh, he was still all green and slimy and cold and clammy, but she took the frog into her bedroom anyway, and she laid the frog down on one edge of her bed, and she laid down on the other edge of her bed, just as far as she could possibly be away from the frog, and then they went to sleep. But early the next morning, while it was still dark, before the sun had come up, the frog woke the girl up. And this time he said to the girl, "Chop off my head, my honey, my sweetheart. Chop off my head, my sweet darling. Remember the words that you and I spoke down by the well of the world's end." Oh, but the girl didn't want to chop off the frog's head. Well, the frog had been very kind to her. He had told her how to fill her sieve with water from the well of the world's end, and by now she was growing rather fond of the frog, and so she said to the frog, "Oh, Froggy, I don't want to chop off your little head. You're such a nice frog, and, well, besides, I've got clean sheets on the bed. I don't want to get blood and guts all over everything. Oh, Icky Poo Frog, I don't want to chop off your head." But the frog said it again. He said, "Chop off my head, my honey, my sweetheart. Chop off my head, my sweet darling. Remember the words that you and I spoke down by the well of the world's end." Well, this frightened the girl. She was very afraid. She picked up a large carving knife, and she chopped off the frog's head. Oh, and behold, where the frog had been, there now stood a handsome young prince. And the prince told the girl that he'd been put under an evil spell by a wicked magician who would never again allow him to become a prince until he could find a fair young maiden who would do his bidding for an entire night long, and at the end of that night chop off his head. Well, the girl and the prince were very happy, and they agreed to be married, but oh, when the girl's stepmother heard out about that, she was just as mad could be, and she was much, much more jealous than she had ever before been of her daughter. Well, that wicked, rotten stepmother spent the rest of her nasty, jealous life going from one out-of-the-way body of water to another, from a lake to a river to a stream to a pond, and she would pick up all the frogs that she could catch, and she'd put them all into a big black bag, and she'd take them all home with her at night, and once she got them there, she'd chop off all of their heads. But she never even found a frog that could talk, let alone one that would turn into a prince. But the girl, on the other hand, well, she married the prince, and they went to live in the castle of his father, the king, and, well, as it happened, after a couple of years, that king died, so the prince became the new king, and the girl became the new queen. So, as you may very well imagine, they both lived very happily ever after.